Good.
Welcome everyone to Living on the Edge 2022. I have Dr. Pauline Baird, who's going to kick off her session now.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. Telling stories and making space. Before I begin formally, I would like to recognize the ancestors on whose land I make home in Japan and their stories. I would also like to recognize the people from my own culture whose stories and lives give me the opportunity to do the work I do. I'm a storyteller and I tell stories about my village. I tell stories to anybody who could listen. I tell stories. Who am I? I'm from Guyana, South America, and we're known as the Caribbean. I'm a Caribbean person, lover of jerk chicken, Nancy stories, roti and curry, and all that good stuff, Bob Marley, reggae, soca, kaiso, that's me. And I use stories in a cultural rhetorics approach to vernacular rhetorics. And I intervene in the oral history of our people. What is cultural rhetorics? Cultural rhetorics is a subfield in the discipline of rhetoric and composition. As a cultural rhetorician, I draw on anthropology, ethnography, narrative studies, cultural studies, linguistics, and a whole gamut of them. So it's intersectional. And my work is at the intersections of all of these and Caribbean studies, which I forgot to put here. Today, I want to demonstrate to you how I do this work. When I talk about cultural rhetorics, I'm talking about a way of designing, doing, a methodology, a how. And I like to do it by constellating stories, just as how you see the heavens are constellated. I constellate stories. You can constellate them any how you want. I can begin at relationships and go to messy in between, and go to becoming. It doesn't matter. And I do this to theorize space making, and that's what I'm going to do today. Now, I'm going to tell you stories, maybe 3 or 4 stories, I think. Here's a story. So I'm in a court of law in this island nation, and I've begun to repeat what the judge says. I'm going to become an American citizen. See, I want to become an American citizen really, really badly, because my spouse would go through immigration and customs and leave me behind. I've got this green book, this guy needs passport, and people are asking me all kinds of craziness, and he would go and leave me. So I was happy to get this American citizenship, among other things. And I'm taking the oath, but apparently I didn't do my homework well enough, because I would have known what I was supposed to say, that there's an oath I have to repeat. So the judge began, and I was going along happily until I heard him say, I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any sovereign prince, potentate, state, sovereignty, of whom or which I have heretofore been a subject or citizen, yada, yada, yada. I didn't hear anything after abjure. I heard abjure. And immediately my brain began to scream. Sell out, hypocrite. I had a problem because I'm, as a cultural rhetorician and an author and a writer and teacher of writing, I deal with words. And abjure was a very strong word: to shun, to give up, to abdicate, to avoid, to renounce, to deny, to reject, to repudiate. I had a problem. I had to fix it fast. I glanced to the right where my colleague from the university was, and our eyes locked. And I knew she knew I had a problem, because she knew my orientation to story. You see, according to Nehusi Kimani, story is history, and history is lived. And she knew I had this big problem because I told stories about women, not just any women, but women from my village. So that's one story. I'm going to tell you another story about making space. I'm Pauline Felicia Baird. I was named after 2 aunts, an architect and an aeronautic engineer. My mother gave me that name, I believe. She was born in my village, and I was born there too. And as far as I know, when women gave birth and the time when I was born in the village, they never went to hospitals to have babies. They had them at home. And once they had them at home, there are two things we already know: that the placenta from the mother would be buried. It would be buried in the ground, not just any ground, but at your grandparents' or your family home. And 9 days later or so, when your umbilical cord dries up and falls off, that too will be buried. So in reality, we are buried, our body parts are buried when we're alive, but not a funeral. It's in celebration of life. You see, it was expedient for them to bury the placenta because they didn't have a way of disposing it. And our placentas don't go into landfills because it's village, we don't have landfills. And it was treated as sacred. It was a mark of life. It was buried under a long living tree, like a coconut tree. It expressed the hopes of her parents. And truth be told, it's a rite of passage of a young girl, a village girl like me, that makes me a bona fide citizen of the land. No one can take that away. So you see why I had this dilemma. Abjure. How could I abjure in good conscience? Because we were planted in the ground to bring about a spiritual and psychological connection. And no amount of abjuring will take that away. I could swear up and down. What I understood here is that our ancestors had passed these rites and rituals down, plant us like seeds, so that we can belong. And so when I open my mouth to bear witness, I'm bearing witness of stories that I've lived. Indigenous people have similar relationships with the land. They have other ways of being, so they could stand alongside my story. And anybody listening to me, if you have similar stories, your stories can be alongside, above, within, around my story. We constellate our stories as ways of entering into each other's narratives and making a place of comfort. So we begin to understand each other despite our differences. America is a story of settlers and Native Americans. Many ancestors came from someplace else. So in that split second, my ancestors came to my rescue. They gave me a way to abjure and become an American. What I learned is that when I do cultural rhetorics and I constellate stories like these, I share stories and make space for home. I relate to citizenship as a dynamic process that helps me make visible maps of connecting. And this connecting, it's related to separation. To connect, you have to be separate. Disconnection, brokenness, relationship, longing, difference, among others. And it behooves me to listen and observe ordinary practices that are integral to the way we appreciate or others appreciate difference. So when I do this land-based thing called storytelling about people from the land and practices of my land, it's a land-based methodology, this story making in this instance. It could be other things. Home is a negotiated space with vernacular practices. In terms of Caribbean rhetorics or Caribbean vernacular practices, Kevin Brown sees it as a connection to African ancestry, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And so I'm bringing to you what is conscious, right? And for some people, they may do it, but they don't really understand what the connection means, or they have a different understanding. And so vernacular practices are ways of reorienting or orienting citizenship and home. And one of my favorite scholarly relatives is Lee Miracle, who says story is theory. So when I tell a story about navel string, I'm theorizing navel string as a vernacular practice that orients and reorients home. So I hope you're with me. And this is not something far-fetched. Mr. Dennis Jones, he was a former banker, war banker. He took his daughter back to Jamaica. They lived in England. And so he made a home space, a way to belong. So he took her back to Jamaica, and he took her to the market and got a coconut because she had been born in England and her navel string wasn't buried there. So he brought it home to bury it, to make a space for comfort, security, freedom, satisfaction, and ultimately confidence. So when she walks in England, she knows she belongs somewhere else, and she can belong in both spaces. So I understand this type of connection as home spaces, as locations for learning about how to negotiate cultural DNA and biological DNA, to talk about how geographies play into that cultural and biological DNA. And these come by way of storytelling. So storytelling is not just telling narratives, they are a whole lot more. Guyanese Egyptologist and professor at Temple University has said that home is not merely a physical and dwelling place of our physical selves, but it's also a location of those invisible but not intangible selves. This I knew at a time when I tell and retell women's stories. So I negotiate that space for comfort and security and satisfaction and ultimately confidence that I belong. But you see, I was still at the American court taking the swearing. So all those things were going through my head. And so Dennis Jones, in all his Caribbean self, he dug the hole and he showed his daughter how to put coconut in the ground, you know, simulating the old ritual when she would have been born, if she had been born in the Caribbean, with how they plant it. I don't know a man does that in the culture. It's mostly women and grandmothers and great aunts that do this. So here again, home is not just a physical place. It's an invisible place where we bring our intangible selves and so much more. Yeah. So I'm going to give you this long quote, which I don't like to do, but I thought it important here. How do I locate these practices? Kimani says, in Africa, before Arab and European disruption, communities developed very close relationship with the land. And culture evolved that was anchored in that relationship. And the land is believed to contain the spirits of the living, whose navel strings are buried there. So that's why when I say I come here, I honor the land and the people of this land, because I don't know what their stories are with the land. So I have to walk and respect that in the way I respect our land. And the spirits of the ancestors, whose physical bodies, but not non-physical aspects of their persons, are also buried there. This attitude is part of a syndrome of values, attitudes, beliefs, and attendant rituals, and other behavior patterns through which it was communicated and through which it may be easily recognized in the African world from ancient to modern times. So I'm not talking about rituals that are long and dead. They're still practiced, and there's a belief system that goes with that. When I was writing my book, Navel String, this book here, when I was writing Navel String, I sat on it for 2 years until I went to South Africa, and I went to the cradle of humankind, and I saw this plaque that says, Africa is the birthplace of humankind. This is where our collective umbilical cord lies buried. I was elated to find it because it's as if my work was being confirmed. Yes. And so I invoke an understanding of the navel string ritual to queer what it means to belong and to establish an identity in places I find myself to be and call home, and to handle differences, because I can belong anywhere. And I have an understanding that everybody has story, and every body, physical body, has stories. So I make relationships with my scholarly relatives. How do I support this work? Because I walk a fine line between academia and the village, what I call village rhetorics. And I don't take lightly the stories I tell, because they have bigger meanings for multiculturalism and diversity and equity and all of that. I link to scholars whose mindsets match mine. And one such is Walter Mignolo. Mignolo says, in the darker side of Western modernity, that home is where you think and dwell. Now, I'm in Japan, and every Sunday, I'm thinking and dwelling at home in that village, because I'm telling the stories to bring those stories to light so that I can learn for myself, teach others, and to anchor myself even while I'm here, so I don't get homesickness. I also connect to Sean Wilson. He's an Indigenous scholar from Canada. He wrote a book called Research is Ceremony. And I understand him to be thinking that home is ceremony. What Sean Wilson did when he was writing his dissertation, he taught his children, they were 6 years old and stuff, what he was doing. He was telling them that he's going into the family ceremonies to talk about how research is done. He was not shy about telling them about ontology and epistemology and all of those things. He wasn't shy at all because he could relate it to ceremony that they were aware of. I really appreciate that. So when I speak of our stories, I'm not shy in using the big words and the positionality. So I talk about constellating. I talk about orientation and reorientation. I talk about decolonization, all that kind of stuff. Nehusi Kimani, in a book he co-edited called A Come Back Home, he talks about place and space as ways of building home and making home. He talks there about there has to be a leaving. And when we're in different countries, whether we're immigrants or we're expats or whatever, there's movement going on. So we can be from everywhere. So when I'm taking the oath, I am conscious that there's a sense that you can only belong one place. And I don't know what to do with that because this whole session tells me that you can belong in other places. Okay, so because we can belong in other places, this story gets really messy. When I tell stories of this kind, I talk about the messy in between, the TMI, messy in between. It's a way of explaining my why. I've come to realize that dual citizenship puts me in a liminal space where I'm becoming but not fully become. I'm troubling in that space. I'm troubled in that space. It's almost like a contact zone that Louise Pratt talks about, where you're rubbing up against ideas and concepts and values. And so that's the messy in between. It's been hinted in so many workshops this weekend. And in the messy in between, you have that cultural and biological DNA that's in the mix, in that soup that I find myself in. I'm not sure about you. I've listened to some presentations and there is that, you know, whether it's a mother story, whether it's following parents or living in a foreign country, it's all there. And the stories of how we negotiate home that are also in this messy in between. So I'm going to go to this activity. I don't know how much time I have, but I want you to indulge me. Think for a minute. What's your name? What's your first name? Who gave it to you? Or who you guess might have given it to you? Where did that person come from? Or where did that person call home? Or what place is that person called home? And what is a story you might have heard whispered about that person's home place? You know, I live out here in Haksan, the foothills of Haksan, and I hear whispered stories of a time when a big flood came in this valley and killed a lot of people, So when I walk on the ground around these mountains every other day, I'm thinking of the DNA in the soil and my feet in the soil. And for me, that's sacred ground. So take a few minutes and write some notes to yourself. What do you know about those stories? And if you don't know the answers, think about a list of steps you could take to find the answers. Like a map, like the doodle thing. Yeah, we could doodle about what comes up. And if you feel brave enough, I invite you to share. So let me stop the share so we can talk. I hope people talk. So,
please leave the questions up so we can see the questions.
Okay, I'm going to share the screen. Okay. All right.
That's fine.
How do I?
Let's give everyone a few minutes to think of their stories.